Well, hello and welcome to another episode of the Imperfect Men's Club podcast. My name is Mark Ilward, and I'm here with my good friend, colleague, and co-host Jim Gurley. And today, Jim and I are going to talk. We're going to reflect back on last week's podcast a little bit, and just to remind people that may or may not have been listening, Jim was getting ready to give a speech. He was preparing for a speech of about 6 minutes in length to an audience that was comprised of approximately 80 people, as I recall, 60 of whom were going to be soon to graduate students, and then the other 20 comprised of perhaps adults, faculty, teachers, parents, what have you, but predominantly students getting ready to step into the workforce, hopefully. And so the way this ties into our wheel, I think most directly, is profession. We're helping, Jim is helping, hopefully helping these kids in some capacity understand what's next, prepare for what's next, get them to think about what's next, and just give that whole what happens after graduation thing context. And then the other kind of flavor to it was one of the themes of Jim's speech was the concept of writing a letter to your 21-year-old self, either in the audience as a 21-year-old or perhaps some of the adults reflecting back on what they would have said to themselves if they were 21 with the wisdom of hindsight. And so, Jim, one of the things that came out of that was you brought up the Pareto Principle, the 80-20 rule, after listening to our podcast on the way to the speech, which sounded like it was helpful. So very interested to hear how things went, how the 80-20 thing came up, and everything else about it.
Yeah, well, it went well. It was about 150 plus, so it was a bigger crowd. Uh, but yes, the 80-20 rule applies in a number of ways. 80% of the attendees were San Jose State design and construction students. So that's what it was a fundraiser event for the Department of Design and Construction for San Jose State. And I was invited, as my to represent the National Kitchen and Bath Association. So I was asked, and so yeah, it went well. Like all speeches, it turns out very different. You don't know until it's over. But I was number three, which reason I'm laughing about that because before me, it was I don't know, I think it was a congressperson, but I don't know, city council or somebody like that, some elected position for San Jose, and then the professor or head of the department for San Jose State University Design and Construction. I'd laugh about that because it's happened before. I did a talk a few years ago at Facebook, and the head of the Stanford department or something. So they go from like the high to the low, as far as the education status of it. So that's always kind of fun. I actually like it because they're talking like a professor, and then I go up, and what I'm going to say is going to be very different than them, right? And then there was like five or maybe more speakers after me. But yeah, it was really helpful. I started off the speech like, hey, I was in preparation. I do a weekly podcast, and we talked about the concept of writing a letter to your 21-year-old self. So I'm going to share that with you, and this will include some wisdom and so on. But in terms of the 80%, I asked the crowd, is anybody familiar with the 80-20 rule? Not surprising, 20% of the people raised their hand. Right. So right away, the 80-20 kicked in. And that was the message. I said, learn the 80-20 rule. And then many other things about wisdom versus advice. And 90% of life is showing up, show up on time, show up all the time, show up with a good attitude, and show up prepared, and you'll be part of the 90%. Those simple ones. But the 80-20 definitely resonated. And afterwards, several people came up to me, but particularly the ones that knew about the 80-20 rule. So then a couple of days later, I said, I know a little bit about it, but I want to do a deep dive. So I had some time on Sunday, and it was really interesting. And I use this framework for just about everything I do now. It's called the 5 W's, right? The who, the when, the where, the what, and the why. No particular order. They're interchangeable, but every subject or any communication includes the 5 W's. So for the 80/20, I decided to go, well, who is this? Who's the 80/20? And it turns out it's an Italian professor, Valfredo Pareto. That's why it's often referred to as the Pareto rule, right, or the
Mhm.
Pareto system. And he was an Italian economist that he was a professor actually that did a paper on real estate. That 80% of the real estate was owned by 20% of the people in Italy during that time. But
Mhm.
what's fascinating about that is that it wasn't just him; it was actually this guy, Joseph Huon. He was a management consultant 40 something years later that took that paper and then really made it part of business. So there's a whole other mathematical formula that demonstrates how this is used in business. And in fact, well, yeah, after World War II, um, Toyota and a few other companies embraced these rules, and it changed the way business is done. So it's not just this Italian professor; it's actually the consultant that took his work and then built on top of it. What's interesting about that is also that's the who, the two guys, but also the time. So the it turns out that this Italian professor it was in the early 19. It's in Switzerland. Obviously, there's some attachment there because I'm Swiss Italian, and this is really interesting though. It was the same time and actually the same place as Albert Einstein in 2005, which published 5 papers that obviously changed the world. So it says something about the time and the place of both of those minds came from the same time and the place. Also happened to be the 2006 San Francisco earthquake. So, it was a
You
long
talk,
time ago.
you mean, not to interrupt, but 1906.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's what I meant to say. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So this concept was it was a paper that he wrote as a professor at a university in Switzerland. But it was really 40 years later when this other business guy took the information and then created a whole industry of what to do with it. So that I thought that was interesting. Again, I recommend anybody do a deep dive on this. But again, it's back to the place. So what was going on in Switzerland in 1906? Yeah, the world was very different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So here's the next one is okay. So what is the we did the who, we did the when, we did the where, and the what, and there's a number of different applications, but in general, the Pareto principle is 20% of your effort results of 80% of your output. That's the kind of the golden rule.
Mm-hmm.
I'll go a couple other ones, but I found that everybody has their version of the 80/20.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll go and kind of go, but what is your version of the 80/20, Mark, and how have you used it? And then I'll share some other examples. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly when it came up, but the context of it was business. And I think
Mhm.
that whether it was business school or I was already out in the workforce, I honestly don't remember, Jim. It feels like
Mhm.
it's been something I've been aware of most of my adult life.
Mhm.
I've never done a deep dive like you did, so I found that very interesting. Some of
Mhm.
that was familiar, some of it wasn't. But just as a for instance, I would say being in sales and
Mhm.
then managing salespeople, it's like, well, 20% of or 80% of your revenue is going to come from 20% of your
Mhm.
clients. And
Yep.
the lessons learned there are very interesting. Also 80% of your complaints are going to come from 20% of your customers. So you
Mhm.
have these areas where, and you've heard this a million times, we try to practice this our whole life in business. It's like, well,
Mhm.
if I could really spend all my energy on my 20% best clients, then I can really almost
Mhm.
ignore the other 80%, and I'm going to go gangbusters. And recognizing that 20% of my customers are bringing 80% of my complaints, that plays out in this whole concept of firing bad customers quickly,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? And so you can lift this burden off yourself on both
Mhm.
sides of that equation just in
Yeah.
business. But you
Yeah.
can anything you can apply a percentage to or numbers to, I think you can plug this principle into.
Right. Well, you'll be interested in to see the result of this deep dive because it changed my overall understanding of it. And this is why I started off by saying there's the Pareto principle from the Italian professor in Switzerland, but it was this other um, business consultant in the 40s that took it. And this is, I'll share a couple of these quotes for you. This is his famous quote because it turns out that you can't throw away the remaining. But before I go into that, yes, it also applies to your employees, right? 20% of your employees will be 80% of your output. It
Mm-hmm.
also applies on the field, whether it's football field, rugby field, baseball field, whatever. Let's face it, right? 20% of the best players will produce 80% of the results. So
Mm-hmm.
it's universal across everything. But this is what I'm glad I did the deep dive because now I have a better understanding of it. The vital few and the useful many to
Mm.
highlight the contribution of the remaining 80% should not be discarded entirely. So a little different than I had a similar understanding than you did that you just disregard the others. No, you can't. It's part of the 80-20. So it's not that you disregard them. You're just aware of that as you go into things. You need them. You need the 100%, but you don't disregard them. And that's what he practiced that in everything that he did as far as business and all that way. So a little bit different than just ignoring
Well,
the
you know what I would say to that, and I totally understand the concept, is I think that when you decide what the 20% are and what the 80% are, whatever the scenario is, I think choosing to include the 80% is a choice, right?
Mhm.
You don't have to or not have to. I think the way that things turn out, the way that you manage those people, the culture that you end up developing, the systems and processes that you put in place, everything else becomes a decision of what am I going to do with that other 80%, right?
Mhm.
It's not you need them or you don't need them. It's like it's going to determine a lot of different stuff as to how this machine works moving forward.
Yep.
Because I think, like, if you remember Jack Welch, the guy from GE, famous,
Mhm. Yeah.
business leader, every year he cut the bottom 10%. That's just what he
Mhm.
did. He didn't make excuses. He didn't tell
Yeah.
stories. He's
Interesting.
like,
Yeah.
the bottom 10 goes, and I'm going to
Yeah.
replace them with another layer of A plus talent on top. And it was
Yeah.
just that constant
Yeah.
regurgitation of the 90-10, which is probably borrowing from the 80-20
It
rule in some
absolutely is. Like
capacity.
I
Yeah.
said, it was a well-known business management style and strategy. So,
Mm-hmm.
but here's some language to it too, right? I have a couple different quotes, but I'm also some graphics. It's the vital few to the trivial many, and then there's a donut of the 100% and then the 20%. The vital few, the trivial many, and he that's how he describes it. So you've got your 100%, but the vital few is 20. Um, Cause and effect is one they use. The 80-20 principle, the secret of achieving more with less. The secret of achieving more with less. Yeah. So there's a couple of quotes, but that's the what. So here's the now when you get down into it, it's the why. Why and how does it apply to different parts of our life? So here's some examples of it. So it starts off again back in the 1900s, where at the time, remember, the world was very different in 1906. So it was also about wealth distribution. It was a lot of his work was challenging the powers to be, and how we were going to deal with wealth distribution,
Mm-hmm.
which is interesting because we're still trying to figure that out right now
Yep.
today, and
Yep.
the election just a few weeks ago is very still related to that. Is
Mm-hmm.
there, so yeah, the backstory is he was an economist that was arguing or making a point that he didn't agree with the powers at the time of how wealth distribution worked. But if you fast forward, really things have not changed. Income 80% of the people pay 20% of the taxes.
Yep. Yeah. Well,
That's a fact. Yeah.
another interesting thing that I saw on your when we were looking at your visual aid was
Mhm.
the language piece, and it made me smile at. And I think if I interpret it correctly, it's like, well, 80% of what I say is only using about 20% of the words that I know.
Yeah.
And so I
Interesting.
we repeat ourselves over and over and over again because we find, I do, phrases and words and language that
Hmm.
suits us. And then you start to hear, like, you and I could probably do it right now if we wanted to, is like, what are the phrases that you use? Oh, you, like, just as a for instance, hey, let's unpack this. Let's
Yeah.
unpack this. That's a segue
Hmm.
that you use all the time,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
But
it's
just
like
to add what you were saying about language, yeah, that's another one. That's one of my, I think, 10 of them. But is that all language, no matter what language it is, you only lose it's 20% of the words are used in the language.
right,
So
right.
and that applies across the board to all languages. We only
Hmm.
use 20% of the vocabulary to communicate 80% of what we're saying. So this rule applies to everything.
Well, the other interesting thing about language is that I personally try to expand my vocabulary all the time.
Uh-huh.
And what I experience in 63 years, it hasn't changed, is I every once in a while I will get a new word or maybe
Mhm.
even a new phrase, but the vast majority of the time it's almost like running into a wall. It's like, no, there's no room for any more new phrases. Just keep using the same shit over and over again because it's been working. And it's like, so I push up against that 80-20 rule with language all the time and I lose most of the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. So here's another one. So again, this is back in 2000. Pareto himself, he started off with this, but it was inspired by his vegetable garden. 80%, 20% of the plants produce 80% of the vegetables in his vegetable garden. And then he went on to do it in property. It also went that study went on to wealth of not just property, but overall wealth. So yeah, the vegetable garden is what inspired him to do this. And then
you know, one of the, one of
business.
the
Go
one of the
ahead.
things that's interesting, Jim, is you're describing in one regard, you're describing what happens in society, whether
Yes.
it's land ownership or distribution of wealth,
Hmm.
and probably a number of other economic factors that are not really, they're bound, but by a society, which is a
Hmm.
very big, loose uh, edges, different rules.
Yep.
But then you take it and you bring it into a corporation which has very specific policies, very
Hmm.
specific systems, very
Yep.
specific processes, and a very specific culture. And even under all those constraints, the 80-20 rule still floats to the
Yeah, yeah,
surface,
yeah. No,
right?
it's an important point. And there's the variable, obviously, but it's not exactly 80-20. There's a
Right.
variable of 30 to 70 or 90 to 10, but
Mm-hmm.
the rule still applies
Mm-hmm.
on that. So yeah, vegetable gardens. The next one was business. You mentioned that before. There's no question. Your problems, everything about your business, your customers, is related to that. Here's another one. So construction injuries. So that's a big thing. If you're a contractor, your injury is a huge part of your business, right? Workman's comp policy and so on. But yeah, 20% of the injuries, yeah, cause it's an 80-20 rule. If you fix one problem, maybe it's a ramp or something as simple as gear, orange gear, so a guy doesn't get ran over by a tractor or something.
Mm-hmm.
You can fix a lot of your problems just by identifying 20% of your injuries come from 20% of your activities, or say
Yeah,
80%. Yeah,
your exposure, your
yeah,
risk. The
yeah,
other interesting thing that just popped into my head is something you said earlier about you don't just discard the 80. You're getting 20% of your
yeah,
revenue. You're getting 80% of your revenue from 20% of your people. Well, what do you do with the other 80% that are not really contributing anywhere near what the 20% are? You don't just discard them. I
yeah.
think there has to be
Yes.
in my experience with a sales team, you always have that one gal or one guy that's
Hmm.
killing it, right?
That's right.
There was always one at the top.
Hmm.
Sometimes there were two,
Yeah.
very infrequently three, but always one. Like, that's the best guy, that's the
Hmm.
best gal. And then everyone else was kind of a gradation down. But you can learn from those people because there's a
Yep.
percentage of those people that you can teach to move up into that 20%.
Yeah, no, it's super important. Again,
Yeah.
this is my takeaway of this. I'm glad I did this because I changed my opinion of how to use this and how it applies to different things. You don't disregard them.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way to measure what is working and what's not, and to bring the other ones up. But it happens again, right? Once you go the 80/20, then it gets reset and happens again and again and
Mm-hmm.
again. So it's
Mm-hmm.
it's it's
Mm-hmm.
it's
And
very dynamic.
even the, 80% of the complaints come from 20% of the people. Yeah, but some of those complaints are probably valid, and I don't
But
think they should be dismissed.
that's exactly what the point he was making.
Mm-hmm.
Don't disregard those; that they're important. So,
Yep.
another one was fundraising. If you've done any kind of fundraising, it's true. 20% of your donors contribute 80% of the total revenue or donation. So
Yep.
it doesn't matter if you have an event. 20% of the people will ultimately contribute 80% of all the
So
income
so
that came
so
in.
what's the behavior component of that one? Because I don't have any real fundraising experience, but I was recently in a conversation with somebody looking for a new executive director to one of the local museums, and we were talking about
Mhm.
the major part of that job was going to be fundraising. If you're getting 80% of your funds from 20% of your people, what are you doing with the other 80%? Are they just getting like a leaflet every 6 months, or like how do you treat that other 80% if you know that 20% of these people are going to fill your coffers?
But yeah, as far as fundraising, I happen to be a couple of fundraising events, and they do auctions. Auctions. That's they auction something, an item off. Well,
Mm-hmm.
again, 20% of the people are the one that raise their hand that buy all the stuff. Every
Mm-hmm.
single auction, no matter where you're at. More than that, actually, it's probably 90/10. 90% of rooms sits on their hands. They don't want
Yep.
to raise their hand. It's
Yep.
that one group, that one table that buys the auction item, and that as a result of the overall income
I
that was
think I
generated.
think and I think another question that intrigues me is that if this in fact if this 80/20 rule, if you can lay it on top of any behavior, which I suspect you can, if some of those behaviors might require a little investigation and a little bit of work, and some of them might be more obvious. But if we just take like what we eat or how we exercise
Yeah,
or
well, I'll go through the list. It does
yeah,
apply. So here it is.
okay.
In time management, 20% of the tasks that will produce 80% of the results. It applies to time management. It's true. 20% of your tasks will produce. So all output of your day is going to be based on the 20% of your tasks that will produce 80% of results. So we talked about spoken language, that was interesting. Here's an interesting. I was surprised to come across this one. Personal relationships. 80% of your satisfaction, 20% of your partner's behavior. Improve our relationship and build stronger connections with our partners. So it turns out that it applies to relationships too. Yeah,
20%
20%
of your
of
behavior contributes to 80% of the other person's happiness or satisfaction.
yes. Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, then it sounds like that in that regard, you are somewhat dismissing some of that behavior. You're just not paying attention to. It's not bothering you, right?
Yeah.
It's like what's bothering you? Well, these two things that you do are the two things that really piss me off out of the 10 things that you do. The other eight I'm fine with. You don't turn the TV off when you're done. I'm good with that. But you do this, that's interesting. That would give you tremendous insight if you wanted to go there
Yes.
into working on your relationship. It's like, okay, well,
Yeah.
I do 10 things because I do 100 things, but 10 of them are like worthy of our discussion, Mrs. Relationship, whatever, wife,
Mm.
girlfriend, whatever. It's like, all right, well, what are the two that piss you off the most? Man, if you
Yeah.
could stop doing this and this, I'd forget about the other eight.
Yeah. Again, I'm reading this.
Let's try
This is
that.
not
Let's try
me
that for a
talking.
sec. I
This
know.
is, but I'll repeat it. 80% of your satisfaction, 20% of our partner's behavior, improve our relationship and build stronger connections. It's Yeah, we tolerate a lot, but if they do 20% of things good, then the relationship, I guess nothing's 100%, right?
No.
But if you do something 20%, then 80% is the result, then you've got a pretty good relationship. But if you throw that off, then it's not a good relationship. So
Well, and the relationships are also in business, right? You have relationships with your salespeople and you have relationships with all
yeah,
your employees. So it's like, if I'm, it's almost like the 20% that are making 80% of the revenue game in a sales environment, it's not that you don't need to do anything at all for them, but the behaviors that you need to show them, like appreciation and recognition and awards and public recognition and private castigation when necessary, not public. But then the other 80%, you're really looking at them, in my estimation, from my experience, you're looking at them saying, where are my opportunities where I can take a B player and turn them into an A player?
Mhm.
And then reverse, where are the people where I really just got to kind of cut my losses? I shouldn't have hired this person. They're not working out. Yeah, I could go to the end of the earth trying to make them productive, but I don't think that's in anyone's best interest. It really does give you a map of how you should approach different people in these different percentiles, because they're not to be approached the same in my
Yeah.
mind.
Yeah, I
You know,
agree. So next one in time management, daily life, 20% activities, 80% productivity, kind of the same thing. A
we're
couple other ones, 20% of crime, not surprised. Is 80% of the crime is committed by 20% of the population,
well, that's a whole podcast episode right
isn't
there.
it? But it's true. I thought this was interesting. The health and fitness of so weight gain comes from 20% of the foods is a result of 80% of your weight gains.
Mhm.
Software development, software developers spend 80% of the time looking for the 20% bugs.
Well, I think it's a great principle. One of the things that and I think that part of what we just did was open up people's minds to the notion that, like, if you're just looking at this as a productivity percentage rule from a work standpoint, think of the other applications. Just let your mind run wild. And I think in order to monitor your success in a particular area of life, it sounds to me like putting on top of that area of your life this 80-20 rule and saying, how does this apply, might be a pretty quick way to get to a higher level of productivity.
Yeah,
It kind of exposes the reality of your circumstance.
right. Especially at 21 years old, because the sooner you learn that, the better off you're going to be as you go into the world. And again, that was the overall message. Was the advice I would give you is uh, number one, show up. It's hard to show up, but
Mm-hmm.
two, understand the 80-20 rule because it applies to everything. And it doesn't may not be fair. I mean, especially in modern day culture, right?
There
There are
is.
people that think everything should be 50-50 or everything should be fair. Well, guess
Mm-hmm.
what? That's not reality. And
Yeah, Mother Nature doesn't even do that.
Mother Nature doesn't even do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting. Like you said, Mark, that could turn into a whole other conversation
Yeah.
of politics and movements or ideologies of how the world should be. Oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's
No, I think that's a, I was going to ask you, not to put you on the spot, but did you have time to talk to any of the kids after the speech? Did this conversation continue, the 80-20 thing, or the writing the letter to a 21-year-old? Did that present itself as an opportunity?
yeah, I had several come up to me afterwards. Again, I was surprised at 20%. And we knew this talking, we as you and I, when we were talking about this, even though I was trying to craft the speech to the audience of the 80% of the students, it really resonated more with the 20% that weren't students,
Hmm.
and which was a nice outcome. I did have a few students reach out to me. They liked it a lot and would benefited from it. But what actually the professor that I was talking to afterwards, it was kind of funny because we were laughing. They were in the back. The students were, so they
Mhm.
were doing what 21-year-olds do, right? And then she laughed. She goes, "You know what? 21 years old, they really don't pay attention to anything. We forget their brains aren't fully developed yet, right? They're still kids in adult bodies." And she made a funny comment like that most of them are just living in the moment, right? They're really not in a place yet to take in that kind of information. So, but no, I'm glad I did it. Like you said, it was really more just to get them thinking about it. I think some will remember and some won't. It'll be the 80-20 rule, like everything else. So.
Yeah, I think if well, I would ask that anybody that is intrigued by the principle, step away from this and do some self-reflection on where might you apply that 80-20 rule that you hadn't thought of before in your life. But
Yeah.
that was fun, Jim.